They always say to trust your instincts. Mine were screaming that night, but I ignored them. It was a long shift at the diner, longer than usual. The rain earlier in the evening had left everything damp and cold, and the air had that metallic, oppressive quality that comes before a storm. My feet ached, my head pounded, and all I wanted was to get home. The shortcut through the park was risky at night, I knew that, but exhaustion overrode caution. The park was deserted, as always, its paths dimly lit by flickering streetlights. The trees loomed tall and skeletal, their branches clawing at the night sky. Each step I took felt louder than it should have, the crunch of dead leaves echoing in the stillness. I told myself the unease was just in my head, a byproduct of being alone in a place that wasn't meant for solitude. Halfway through, I saw him. He stood under a broken street lamp, his face obscured by the brim of a hat that cast a shadow down to his chest. His coat was too long, nearly brushing the ground, and he stood unnaturally still, like a mannequin left in the rain. I hesitated, heart pounding. "Hey," I called, more to break the silence than anything else. My voice sounded weak, swallowed by the night. He tilted his head ever so slightly, and though I couldn't see his face, I felt his eyes on me. It wasn't just unsettling. It was wrong, like his gaze had weight, pressing down on my chest. "Stay out of the shadows," he said, his voice low and hoarse. The words hit me like a gust of cold air, though there wasn't so much as a breeze. I blinked, and he was gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. I spun in place, scanning the path and the trees. Nothing. No footsteps, no rustling leaves. The air itself felt heavier, pressing against my skin like wet cotton. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it, but his words clung to me, a lingering echo in my mind. Stay out of the shadows. The rest of the walk home was a blur. My apartment, with its warm lights and familiar clutter, should have felt like a sanctuary. Instead, I locked every door and drew every curtain, feeling watched even in my own space. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When it did, it was broken by dreams I couldn't remember but woke from with my heart racing. Even then, in the safety of my bed, I felt his presence, like a phantom standing just beyond the edge of the light. The news came 2 days later. It was a brief segment buried between weather updates and local sports. A woman's body had been found in the park. No signs of violence, no marks on her skin, but her face, frozen in a mask of pure terror, made it impossible to look away from the screen. The reporter's voice was professional, almost clinical, but the image they flashed of the police cordon sent a chill up my spine. The spot they showed, just beyond a broken street lamp, was where I'd seen the man. The warning replayed in my mind. Stay out of the shadows. What had he meant? Was it just a coincidence? I told myself it had to be. Urban legends were born from this sort of thing. Freak accidents twisted into ghost stories. But something didn't sit right. That night, the apartment felt smaller than usual. The walls too close, the shadows deeper. I kept the lights on, trying to convince myself it was just paranoia. I even called a friend to distract myself, but I didn't mention the park or the news. Talking about it would make it too real. Around midnight, as I was scrolling through social media, I noticed it. At first, it was just a dark patch on the far side of the room, near the corner where my bookshelf stood. I thought it was the play of light from my lamp, the way the bulb cast uneven shadows. But the patch wasn't static. It was shifting, stretching like ink spilled in water. I stared, heart pounding, waiting for my brain to explain it away. A trick of tired eyes, a draft moving the curtains, anything rational. But the shadow didn't need the light to move. It slid upward, clawing its way across the ceiling, defying the boundaries of the room. My breath caught when it stopped, hanging just above me like a storm cloud poised to strike. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a glass of water from the nightstand, and hurled it toward the ceiling. The glass shattered on the floor, water splattering everywhere. But the shadow didn't flinch. It just loomed there, growing darker, more solid, until I swore I could hear it breathing. I scrambled to the bathroom, slamming the door shut and turning on every light. My pulse thundered in my ears as I pressed my back against the cold tiles, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The shadow hadn't followed, but I could feel it just beyond the door, waiting. That was the moment I stopped doubting. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't a hallucination. It was real, and it wanted me. I didn't leave the bathroom for hours. The overhead light buzzed faintly, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. My knees ached from sitting on the tiled floor, but I didn't dare move. I kept the door locked, though deep down, I knew that if the shadow wanted in, it wouldn't need to turn the handle. When I finally worked up the courage to peek into the living room, it was gone. At least, it seemed gone. The corner where the shadow had first appeared looked normal again. The bookshelf was just a bookshelf. The air was still heavy, though, like a storm was about to break. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I buried myself in research, trying to find anything online that could explain what was happening. The results weren't comforting. Stories of shadows moving on their own weren't new. They stretched back centuries, woven into folklore from every culture. Some claimed they were spirits of the dead. Others said they were demons, predators from another realm. But the details that matched my experience were disturbingly specific. One post on an old, forgotten forum described an entity of darkness that pursued people in isolation. It started subtly, a flicker in the corner of your eye, a dark spot in a lit room. But the closer it came, the colder and heavier the air grew, until it touched you. I rubbed the spot on my hand where the shadow had grazed me the night before. The skin felt tender, almost bruised, though there was no mark. The forum thread ended abruptly, the original poster never replying to the follow-up questions. One comment caught my attention. You can't run from it. It feeds on fear and darkness. If it's chosen you, you have two choices. Confront it, or it will consume you. The words chilled me to the core. Confront it? How? As the hours dragged on, the tension in the apartment grew unbearable. Every shadow felt like a threat. Even the sunlight streaming through the windows seemed pale and ineffective, as if the dark corners of the room were mocking it. By evening, I was desperate. I found another post, a supposed ritual to banish malevolent shadows. The instructions were cryptic and contradictory. Light candles, draw a circle, chant ancient words that didn't come with a translation. It sounded like nonsense, but what choice did I have? I scribbled the ritual down on a scrap of paper, gathering the supplies it listed. Candles, chalk, salt. My hands trembled as I worked, drawing the circle in the middle of the living room and surrounding it with flickering flames. As the final candle was lit, the room grew deathly quiet. Not even the hum of the refrigerator broke the silence. I stood at the edge of the circle, paper in hand, waiting for something to happen. And then it came. The shadow didn't creep this time. It poured into the room like water through a broken dam, swallowing the walls, the floor, the light. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was alive, shifting and writhing, a black mass that pulsed with malevolent intent. This was no trick of the mind, no hallucination. It was here, and it wanted me. I stepped into the circle, heart pounding, and began to recite the words. The words trembled on my lips, foreign syllables that felt wrong in my mouth, heavy like lead. I spoke them anyway, the paper shaking in my hands as the shadow writhed just beyond the circle of flickering candles. The air was suffocating. Every breath felt like inhaling smoke, thick and cloying, and the room was freezing. The shadow wasn't just dark. It was an absence, a void that swallowed light and sound, leaving only an unnatural, pulsating silence. As I chanted, the shadow pushed closer, testing the edges of the circle. The flames of the candles guttered, bending toward it like they were being drawn into its gravity. I kept my eyes fixed on the mass, fighting the instinct to look away. I knew, deep in my gut, that if I broke my focus, it would consume me. The shadow's shape began to change. Tendrils unfurled, snaking toward me, stopping just short of the salt-lined edge. It recoiled, then surged forward again, more aggressive this time, as though it was growing impatient. A whisper filled the air, low and guttural, seeping into my ears even though I couldn't understand the words. It wasn't coming from outside me. It was inside, coiling around my thoughts, sowing seeds of panic. "You can't stop me," it seemed to say. "You are mine." I forced myself to keep chanting, louder now, pushing the words out with every ounce of strength I had. The tendrils flinched, withdrawing slightly, and the shadow hissed, an inhuman sound that vibrated through my skull. But it wasn't enough. The flame of one candle sputtered and died. The circle shuddered, the chalk line breaking in one spot as the air in the room shifted. The shadow surged forward faster than I could react, one tendril darting across the gap to wrap around my ankle. The cold was immediate and consuming, an icy void that sucked the strength from my body. My voice faltered, the chant breaking as the shadow yanked me toward it. I screamed, kicking wildly, but the shadow tightened its grip, dragging me closer to the edge of the circle. I scrambled for the salt, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the container. With a desperate cry, I flung it over the broken chalk line, the grains scattering into the air. The shadow recoiled with a deafening screech, retreating back to the edges of the circle. The candles flared brighter, their flames burning a harsh, angry orange. I fell back into the center of the circle, gasping for breath. My ankle throbbed where the shadow had touched it, the skin raw and icy, as though frostbite had set in. But I couldn't stop. The ritual wasn't finished. Gathering the last shreds of my courage, I began chanting again, louder, faster as the shadow circled me like a predator waiting for the moment to strike. The words tore from my throat, raw and desperate, as the shadow pressed against the circle, testing it, battering the fragile boundary I had drawn. It moved faster now, its tendrils writhing like serpents, probing for weakness. Each flicker of the candles felt like a countdown, their flames guttering under the weight of the oppressive dark. My voice cracked, but I forced myself to continue, clinging to the chant like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The shadow hissed, retreating slightly, then lunged forward again with renewed fury. The room felt impossibly small. The walls seemed to close in, the air heavier with each passing second. It was as if the shadow was pulling the space around it into itself, consuming everything, leaving only the void. Then it changed. The tendrils fused together, and the shadow began to rise, taking on a humanoid shape. It was grotesque, a distortion of a person. Too tall, limbs too long, its edges flickering like a faulty signal. It had no face, yet I could feel it watching me, its gaze burning into my skin. Enough. The word wasn't spoken. It was an intrusion, slicing into my mind like a shard of glass. I staggered, the chant faltering as a wave of nausea swept over me. The candles flickered violently, one snuffing out entirely. The shadows around the room grew darker, stretching, merging with the figure inside the circle. I fell to my knees, clutching the paper in trembling hands. My mind screamed at me to keep going, but my body was failing, drained by the cold and the weight of its presence. The shadow stepped closer, its movements unnatural, jerky, as though it was learning how to walk. The salt line held, but just barely. The faint shimmer of the barrier flickered like a dying light bulb. You belong to me. The words hit me again, and this time they came with images. Flashes of a void, endless and suffocating, pulling me down, down, into a place where light had never existed. My breath hitched, my chest tightening as panic threatened to take over. "No!" I screamed, my voice breaking the silence, cutting through the oppressive dark. I grabbed the last unlit candle and the lighter beside it, forcing my hands to steady. The shadow lunged, its tendrils slamming against the barrier, shattering part of the salt line. The room plunged into chaos as the darkness surged forward, swallowing the edges of the circle. With trembling fingers, I lit the candle, holding it high as I shouted the final words of the chant. The flame roared to life, impossibly bright, its light cutting through the shadow like a blade. The figure screamed, a sound so loud and primal it felt like it was tearing the air apart. Its form writhed, collapsing in on itself as the light consumed it. And then, silence. The candles burned steady once more, their flames calm and unwavering. The shadow was gone, or so it seemed. I stayed in the circle for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. When I finally stepped out, the apartment was eerily quiet, the air unnervingly still. But even as relief washed over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not entirely.